In the far north of Europe, where the wind blows furiously and the silence of the deep snows seems to hold ancient secrets, there is a land that defies life itself, Scandinavia. A place where the sun hides for months and the cold penetrates the bones like a sharp blade. There, in the inhospitable vastness of rugged mountains and frozen fjords, rose a people whose existence was a constant challenge to the forces of nature, the Vikings. Contrary to what the bards of the warm lands of the south tell us, the Vikings were not born to pillage and war. They were born to resist. Before they raised swords against foreign kingdoms, they wielded axes against darkness and ice. This is the true epic, not that of conquests by sea, but the ancestral saga of survival in a world shaped by the fury of the gods. Our account begins in a small coastal village called Vetraheim, nestled between the rocks and the icy sea of the north. The village barely appeared on maps, but an ancient lineage flourished in it. The Winter Wolves, a clan known for its resilience and wisdom in the face of the cold. On the night of the winter solstice, as the auroras danced in the sky like luminous serpents, a child shrouded in omens was born. Eric, the son of Harold the Silent and Hilda, the singer of the seasons. The wind howled as if greeting the newborn, and the midwife, an old woman with eyes pale as snow, whispered that the boy would bring warmth where the ice dominated. From his first breath, Eric was shaped by the cold. His crib was made of raw wood and wolf skins. The walls of the house in which he lived were covered with dry moss and sheep's wool soaked in fat, insulating life from the white death that reigned outside. When he cried, it wasn't because of the cold, it was because of the silence. From an early age, he seemed to carry the weight of generations in himself. Old Skjaldulf, the clan elder, said that the gods had given the people of the north a gift disguised as a curse, the eternal cold, which separated the weak from the worthy, which tested the soul even before the body. There is no greater honor than to wake up in a world where everything tries to kill you, and yet sing. And the winter wolves sang around the fire, even when it threatened to go out under the breath of the wind. Hilda, Eric's mother, was the one who kept this fire burning, not just the fireplace fire, but the clan spirit. Her songs were not just melody, but memory. At the sound of her voice, the elders remembered past winters, and the younger ones learned the names of ancestors who had frozen to death guarding their families. Harold, the father, was the silence, a man as big as the mountains, with eyes as gray as the sky before the blizzard. It was said that in his youth he had crossed the ice to the North Sea and faced a white beast, perhaps a bear, perhaps a demon, and returned with only one eye and a scar running across his face. He never confirmed or denied it. His way of teaching was the example. Eric's childhood had no toys, but it did have snow, firewood, and sweat. At the age of 5, he was already helping to carry logs to the house. At 7, he learned to hunt from his uncle Jorn, who taught him to listen to the forest even when it was buried under 2 meters of snow. "Silence speaks," Jorn said. "If you know how to listen, the cold warns you when it comes to kill." Each station brought a new lesson. In the fall, they learned how to stock up on food, how to dry fish and elk meat, how to bury roots in isolated holes with clean snow. In the winter, they trained to build emergency shelters, to light fires with stone and flint, even when their fingers were unresponsive. In the summer, they gathered herbs and mosses that served as medicine or insulation. In the spring, They celebrated those who had survived. But there was more than technique. There was faith. The old gods were not indifferent to the cold. They were part of it. Skadi, goddess of hunting and snow, was revered on the ice trails. Thor was summoned when the cold became a battle. Odin, the father of all, was remembered next to the funeral pyres as a guide for those who froze to death. And so, under the gaze of the gods and the constant whip of frost, Eric grew up, not as an ordinary child, but as a living spark in the darkness of the north. His eyes shone with the flame of ancient fire, and his footsteps left deep marks in the snow. The cold molded, forged, and destroyed. But to those who learned its language, it revealed its secrets. And Eric, the winter wolf, was destined to decipher them. This is just the beginning of the saga. For before the boats cut the seas and the axes erected empires, there was the oldest battle of all: man against eternal winter.
Time was advancing in Vetraheim, and with it grew the boy who had been blessed by the auroras and the fury of the wind. By the time he was 12, Eric was already known as the one who didn't feel the cold, not because it didn't hit him, but because he stared at it, as if he could tame it at will. The elders said that he possessed Blóð Elden, the blood of fire. But Eric himself did not believe in legends. He believed in work. As a teenager, he learned from the old craftsmen how to build winter shelters out of logs fitted with surgical precision, filling the gaps with moss and ice-hardened clay. Every detail was vital. A poorly sealed crack could mean the death of an entire family while sleeping. He learned how to carve sleds out of whalebone blades and how to use seal blubber as fuel for oil lamps that burned even in the Arctic winds. But it was in the hunts that the young Viking became a man. One dark dawn, when the wind hissed like an angry serpent, Eric was sent with 3 other young men to hunt a snow boar, a rare creature whose flesh sustained the clan for weeks. They walked 2 days without seeing the sun. When they finally found the animal, they realized that they were surrounded by a pack of hungry wolves. The oldest of the group, Sven, hesitated. The others retreated. Eric moved forward, not out of bravery, but because he had seen in the eyes of the wolves something familiar, the despair of a people who were also struggling to survive the cold. He raised his spear, not to kill the wolves, but to scare away the fear of men. With screams and embers in hand, he chased away the beasts. They returned to Vetraheim with the boar, but also with a new legend. Eric, the one who stared into the eyes of the hunger and did not blink. Over time, the masters began to entrust him with adult responsibilities. He was sent with Jorn and other hunters to the north coast, where ice was gathering on white walls, to fish for seals and collect bird eggs from the frozen cliffs. They spent 20 days outside, sleeping in caves and eating fat soup with roots. It was there that Eric learned the limit of the body and learned that the mind was stronger than the flesh. When he returned, he did not seek the comfort of home, but the forge. He had decided that he would learn to shape his own axe. Ragnar Hands of Smoke, the clan's blacksmith, initially mocked his decision. "Iron is more stubborn than ice, boy," he said. But when he saw Eric spend days cleaning the forge, feeding the embers, and waking up before the sun to study the sound of the metal as it was struck, Ragnar relented. He gave him a piece of iron, extracted from a meteorite that had fallen in the north years ago. "This is steel from the heavens," he said. "If you can mold it, maybe the gods will listen to you." After 40 days and 40 nights, Eric presented his axe. Hjartekelt, the cold heart, light as dry wood but sharp as the first breath of winter. The blacksmith said nothing, just nodded, and handed him a chain with the symbol of Skadi. He was recognized as a man. At the age of 17, Eric was already part of the clan's youth council. He didn't talk much. He had inherited his father's silence, but when he did, the others listened. He was practical, firm, but never merciless. In an especially severe winter, when there was a lack of food, it was his proposal to hunt in groups and divide the prey among neighboring clans. Some protested, saying that they should keep what was theirs. Eric replied, "There is no ours if we all die. Ice does not recognize clans." These words were carried to the elders of other villages. For the first time in decades, a unified caravan of hunters set out for the southern mountains. The hunt lasted 8 days and yielded furs, meat, and respect. It was the beginning of something bigger, of something that broke the tribal isolation of the peoples of the north. Meanwhile, as the cold mounted, so did the rumors that a new age of darkness was approaching. The elders spoke of a cyclical time, the Fimbul winter, the Great Winter, where the world would plunge into 3 seasons without sun. Many laughed, but Eric listened attentively. He knew that legends, like the cold, carried hidden truths. On the last night of the following summer, under the spectral glow of the auroras, Eric had a dream. He walked through a white field where hooded figures watched him in silence. One of them handed out her hand and said, "Ice is your burden, but also your weapon. Carry it with honor." He woke up bathed in sweat, even though the temperature was below freezing. And so, the young winter wolf ascended, not as a king, nor as a warrior, but as a leader. And soon the cold would test everything he had learned. Winter was approaching, and it wouldn't be an ordinary winter. There wasn't just one clan in the icy lands. Survival depended as much on one's own effort as on the recognition that the North was vast and its children diverse. To the east of the Gray Mountains, the snow gares lived among eternal pine forests. To the south, on the windy white plains, the ice hammers forged storm weapons. On the islands surrounded by mist and raging seas, there were the sons of Skadi, a silent people hardened by salt and snow. Eric, in his youth, visited each of these peoples. His father believed that in order to understand the cold, one had to know it in all its forms. Eric traveled with Yorn, taking gifts and furs for exchange, but also observing. In each village, he learned a new way of resisting. With the snow bears, he learned to hunt using traps that mimicked freshly fallen snow. He saw how they buried grains in clay pots sealed with wax, kept in deep crevices in the rocks, where the cold preserved without destroying. There he met Freydis, a woman with eyes so light that they seemed to reflect the moon itself. She was a healer and priestess of Skadi, master of the roots that burned on the tongue but warmed the blood. It was said that she had saved 100 children from freezing to death, using ointments and ancestral words. Eric saw in her a fire similar to his own, not in strength, but in persistence. In the ice hammer, he met Bjorn, a forging warrior whose beard froze even in the face of fire. There, the philosophy was simple. The cold was a battle, and each icy breath was an enemy to be overcome with steel, stone, and roars. Bjorn taught Eric to fight with 2 blades, to use the enemy's weight against him, and to keep his body heat in constant motion. If it stops, it freezes. If you fear, you die. In the Sons of Skadi, however, Eric found silence. The clan was made up of sailors and winter fishermen. Their boats crossed the frozen sea, breaking ice with reinforced hulls. They used cloud maps, deciphered winds, fished through holes in the frozen crust. There he met Freydis, the wind weaver, creator of clothes that withstood the deepest cold. She wore wool soaked in whale tallow, sewn with sinew thread and covered in boiled oil. His fingers, however, were deformed by the freeze. Each stitch of sewing was paid for pain. But she smiled. The pain reminds me that I still do, and if I still feel it, I can still protect it. Eric returned to Vetraheimer different. He carried with him what he called the wisdom of the ice, the understanding that no single clan could dominate the north. The cold respected no borders, and survival was a shared science written with blood and ice. On his return, during a council of elders, he stood up among the chiefs and said, "Each of us keeps a secret from the cold, and each one dies a little when he denies this secret to his brother. If we want to see our children walk in the sun again, let us make knowledge our torch." Freydis, who had traveled with him to Vetraheimer, nodded. Bjorn grunted but didn't contest. Astrid silently handed him a cloak made of her clan's cloth. It was the recognition that ice is not fought only with muscles, but with memory, wisdom, and unity. It was there that the embryo of what would later be called the Council of Embers, an informal alliance of masters of the cold who shared techniques, stories, and warnings about changing winds. Alongside the ice peoples, Eric not only grew as a leader, but as a symbol. It was the link between the tribes, a son of the north, not of a single clan, but of all those who breathed the biting morning air, who woke up on an empty stomach and yet found the strength to smile by the fireside. And the gods watched, for the gods of cold did not require worship, they required endurance. And in this young man with steady eyes and a burning heart, they saw the spark of something that could change the course of Midgard. But the cold, always the cold, did not rest. He was also preparing. Before thinking about battles or expansion, the peoples of the north first needed to win the most constant and brutal war, the one that was fought every day against the eternal cold. Eric understood this like few others. The real battlefield was everyday life itself. Thus, before the achievements came the planning. He gathered the knowledge gained from each clan and began to build a doctrine of survival, a science of life on the ice. He created what he called the 7 pillars against winter, fundamentals that could be taught in any village at any time. 1. Living shelter. Houses half buried, with a sloping roof covered in layers of earth and moss. Human warmth was maintained with stones heated on the fire and positioned under the benches. 2. Intelligent fire. Chimneys not too high to prevent heat loss. Fires built in stone circles with copper reflectors when available. Whale blubber was the preferred fuel.
3. Clothing as armor. Layers upon layers. Wool, furs, leather. The secret was in the spacing between the fabrics, which trapped the air and worked as an insulator. Astrid trained seamstresses from various clans. 4. Food as strength. Fermented roots. Meat preserved in fat. Thick bone soup and marrow. Fasting was taught as a spiritual and physiological practice to preserve energy. 5. Surveillance of the heavens. Constant observation of the winds, clouds, the behavior of crows and wolves. Each change in temperature could mean a new challenge. 6. Constant movement. Even inside the houses, people could not stay still for long. Children played endurance games. The elderly walked in circles. The stopped blood was the harbinger of death. 7. Practical faith. Daily cults of Skadi and Thor were followed by tasks. Faith was worked together with action, such as lighting the fire, caring for the elderly, teaching the young. The gods did not want subjects, but partners in the struggle. Eric sent emissaries so that each nearby village would receive a master from one of the founding clans. Freydis brought herbs and healing rituals. Bjorn trained young men with heavy wood instead of swords. Astrid sewed, but she also taught mothers to pass on the knowledge. There was resistance. Some old chiefs did not want foreigners dictating their traditions. One of them, Ulf the Frost, even banished a team sent by the Snow Bears. But weeks later, a devastating blizzard hit their village. Half died. The survivors, without pride, were welcomed by Vetrheim. Eric received them with hot coals and root bread, without judgment. He only said, "The cold already judges for all of us." Time passed, and a communication network was formed. Climate listening groups, envoys that brought news and techniques. A marking system with stones and runic symbols on the trails showed safe paths, caves with supplies, and danger warnings. It was the birth of the geography of cold, a kind of invisible map that only the initiated knew how to read. At this time, the skalds, poets of the embers, began to sing the exploits of Eric, not in battles, but in feats such as preventing the freezing of an entire valley with a simple change in architecture. The songs spoke of the man who listened to the ice and responded with ingenuity, not violence. Meanwhile, children grew up learning that surviving was more valuable than conquering. Young people were taught not to fear the cold, but to dance with it, as if each gale were a rough but necessary partner. The people began to bloom in winter, and that in itself was an act of war against the White Death. But the peace would be short-lived. The winds were changing, and the big test was yet to come. The following winter was the most severe in 3 decades.
Winds from the mountains covered entire villages in snow in a matter of hours. Animals disappeared beneath the white, rivers froze to the marrow, and even the crows, lords of the northern sky, flew low, exhausted. It was this winter that Eric realized it was time to act beyond words. The first conquest was not of territory, but of trust. The Fists of Frost clan, isolated for years in the Boreal Hills, sent a distress call. Their stores had been consumed by hungry rats, and the wood for fires had been soaked by seepage. Eric didn't hesitate. He set up an expedition with sledges, supplies, and above all, human warmth. Bringing embers is not enough, he said. Also bring stories, songs, and hands that know how to repair roofs. When they got there, they found cracked houses, children covered in torn fabrics, and voiceless men overcome with shame. Eric did not rebuke them. He worked alongside them, carrying firewood, nailing boards, teaching the children how to make emergency fires. Within days, the Fists of Frost were not only standing, but singing around a new central fireplace built of stones enchanted by Freda's runes. The news ran like a spark in dry straw. More clans began to ask for help, but also to offer something in return. The Eyes of the Wind clan taught them how to predict blizzards 3 days in advance by deer behavior. The Children of the Frozen Sea brought new nets and ice fishing techniques with mirrors and high-pitched sounds. That was how the achievement became a movement. Entire villages began to adopt the 7 pillars, and new practices emerged each season. Vetrenheim had become more than a village. It was now a lighthouse, a center of innovation and faith. But not everyone saw this with good eyes. In the far west, old Sigivard the Red, chief of the Northern Hammer, watched with suspicion as Eric's influence grew. For him, the gods had created the cold to separate the strong from the weak. To help the weak was to go against the divine will. In a solemn meeting, Eric confronted him. And if the gods didn't want us to help, why would they give us the gift of warmth? Sigivard laughed, but did not answer. He knew he had lost the attention of the younger ones. Still, he refused to join the alliance. It would not be the last time they would oppose each other. That same year, the first unified maps of the North were carved in stone and shared. The ancient trails of the hunters became avenues of communication between clans. Guardians of the routes were appointed, and secret runic symbols were taught to the initiates. With the routes open and active cooperation, the Viking people not only survived the cruelest winter, but flourished in it. For the first time in centuries, more people were born than died in one winter. And at the end of the season, when the first sprout broke through the snow in the field of Vetrenheim, the elders declared, "This is no longer the time of survival. This is the time of conquest of the cold." It was the beginning of a new era. but in the shadows of the mountains, where the ice never melts, forgotten forces were awakening. Not all the cold came from the sky. Some were born from the hearts of men.
The time when the northern peoples flourished seemed like a late but inevitable spring. However, every spring there is one last frost, treacherous, unexpected, and cruel. And that frost came in the form of wounded pride and the ancient belief that only the strong deserved to live. Sigvard the Red, chief of the Hammer of the North, did not accept the new world that rose under the banner of unity. He saw in Eric not a leader, but a heretic. He gathered the clans that shared his thinking, the Black Claws, the Snowtooths, the Eyes of Thunder, all of them proud, hardened by generations of pain, but unable to accept help as a virtue. The first blow was not with swords, but with silence. They interrupted the flows of exchange, closed trails, erased runes from the paths. The cold rained again on the routes between the villages. Hunters disappeared. Messengers disappeared. The map of the north again became a deadly enigma. Eric tried diplomacy. She sent Freydis with words of reconciliation, but she was met with stones and arrows. She came back wounded and silent. "What did they say?" Eric asked. Freydis stared at the fire for a long time before replying, "That the cold will choose. Bjorn Rosnu, then let him choose. We are ready." The inevitable battle was brewing, but Eric didn't want war. He wanted justice. He proposed one last alternative, a ritual challenge old as the mountains. Not an open war, but a clash between champions, followed by a decision by the Council of Embers. If Eric won, the clans would unite again. If he lost, he would leave Vetterhammer and never return. Sigvard accepted. He knew that Eric was strong, but he believed that his years of preparation had not made him a warrior. The arena was set up in the Valley of the Runes, where the ice never melted and the stones echoed the cries of the ancestors. Thousands flocked, not to see blood, but to see destiny unfold beneath the heavens. The challenge consisted of 3 tests: endurance, wisdom, and combat. In the first, the champions had to walk barefoot through a field of brittle ice, carrying lighted torches. Eric crossed with his eyes fixed on the horizon, unhurried. Sigvard ran, and his torch nearly went out. First test: draw. In the second, they had to answer riddles of the elders about the cycles of the snows, the winds, and the stars. Eric answered with precision and humility. Sigvard arrogantly got 2 answers wrong. Second race, Eric. In the third, hand-to-hand combat, Sigvard was crude, trained, ruthless. Eric was agile, strategic. The fight lasted eternal minutes. Sigvard struck hard, but Eric deflected wisely. In the final moment, Eric could have won with a fatal blow. But it stopped. He put Hjartekult's blade against his rival's chest and said, I can win by arm, but I want to win by example. You can still join us." Sigvard, panting, fell to his knees. "Damn you, boy, damn you! You defeated me without killing me." And on that day, under the gray sky, the war ended. The clans, one by one, reconvened. The cold watched, still there, but tamed by something stronger: choice. Not to kill, but to live together. And Vetterheimer has become more than a village. It has become a symbol, a home not only of a people, but of a new world. But Eric knew the greatest battle was yet to come, not against men, but against time itself.
Winter had been overcome, but the cold still dwelt in hearts and winds. The victory in the Valley of the Runes had been symbolic. Powerful, yes, but true unification required more than a battle. It required structure. Eric convened the first enlarged Ember Council. Representatives of all clans, including those who had previously opposed them, came to Vetterheimer. They sat not on thrones, but on logs around a great central hearth, where fire represented not power, but communion. For 7 days and 7 nights, they argued how to share food, how to organize the paths, how to teach young people. It was the birth of a new order, not an empire like those in the south, with kings and taxes, but a federation of clans based on vote, word, and alliance of heat. In the end, a name was given to the union: Noravind, the United North Wind. Eric was proclaimed Keeper of the Ice, not king, not lord, but one whose job it was to ensure that no people would ever again freeze in solitude. His function was to watch over the circulation of the flame, of knowledge, of help, of hope. The people celebrated with 3 days of bonfires, dances, and storytelling. Skalds immortalized the journey from Eric's childhood to the unification of peoples. The gods, according to Freydis, had smiled that night. The dawns were more vivid than ever seen. Temples were built not with gold, but with stone, wood, and runes for protection. Instead of sacrifices, alliances were celebrated. Each clan began to send young men to learn in Vetterheimer and then return as ember bearers, ambassadors of unity and science against the cold. It was also during this time that the Hartecult Guard was born, a brotherhood of men and women trained to guard the paths, teach the 7 pillars, and keep the memory of the resistance alive. Bjorn, now older, became its first commander. Astrid taught the new generations of weavers, and Freydis founded the Hall of Roots, where bodies and hearts were healed. But with the union came the first frictions. Centralization, although done with good intentions, began to cause imbalances. Distant villages felt overwhelmed with demands to send resources or representatives. Some elders said they were forgetting their old ways. One of them, Hroald of Skalingard, said, Before, we shared the cold. Now we share bread with those we don't even know the name of. The administrative structure of the Federation grew, and with it, roles, functions, attributions emerged. Simple men who had previously fished and hunted were called upon to serve as watchmen, messengers, and store organizers. Not everyone understood the purpose, and the longing for autonomy increased. Eric realized this and tried to slow down the process. He created the Circle of Free Elders, where representatives could criticize decisions and propose adjustments, but not everyone felt heard. In addition, Vetraheimer's fame provoked envy. Some clans began to say that the capital absorbed the best young people, the best resources, and that it would soon become more important than the gods themselves. Is Eric the new Odin? Some scoffed. There were protests, small, discreet, but real. A group of young people set fire to one of the ceremonial pillars erected near the south wall. It was contained, but the message was clear. The empire that was warming was also beginning to burn. In a secret meeting, Freitas warned Eric, "Beware of the light that is too bright. Even fire can be blinding." Eric, tired, replied, "I thought the cold was our only enemy, but maybe be the heat itself." Still, he stood firm. He knew that the price of the union was high, but he believed that loneliness would cost him even more. And so, while the people learned to live in a new world, Eric walked in silence with the weight of the world on his shoulders. The external cold had been overcome, but the internal cold was beginning to blow between the cracks of the promise, and the next snowfall was already forming beyond the mountains.
Unification brought warmth to the northern reaches, but also cast long shadows among men. Not everyone was ready for the ties that now bound them together. In the icy confines of Fjornkalt and Skalingard, where time seemed to run slower and customs were as old as petrified oak trees, centralization was felt as a loss, not progress. In many villages, the elders looked suspiciously at the messengers of the Ember Council. Accustomed to making decisions based on the voice of the wind, the shaman, and the stars, they now received orders from halls they had never set foot in. Young people, attracted by Vetraheimer's stories, set out in search of learning and rarely returned. The void left by them was filled with silence and distrust. "The embers they take are cold for us," said a matriarch from Harvik, whose granddaughter now trained in the Hierarchicalt Guard. The very cycle of hunting, gathering, and planting was altered by requirements for quotas and contributions. In ancient times, clans stored just enough for themselves and travelers. Now, barrels and sledges were shipped to the capital. This required more hands, more organization, more bureaucracy. Many wondered, was this the price of protection? Snow counters began to emerge, bureaucrats who traveled village by village, cataloging resources, capacities, surpluses. The idea was to better distribute the stocks, but in the mouths of the people, they became spies of the flame. Eric, in his intention to avoid future famine, fed the present resentment. The social divide became more visible. In Vetrahimer, castes of knowledge and influence emerged. The Ember Bearers, though well-intentioned, began to be seen as elite. They wore different clothes, wore special runes, and carried with them the weight of decisions that affected distant villages. The smaller villages called them sons of other people's fire. Freydis tried to intervene. He sent groups of listeners, healers, and artists to reconnect with them, but the damage was already done. A small uprising erupted in Korskallen when residents prevented a warehouse from being emptied in the name of sharing. The guard was called, but Eric ordered them not to use weapons. Even so, there was conflict. 2 men froze to death while trying to flee through the forest. The impact was brutal. For the first time since unification, blood had been shed between brothers. The skalds sang in a funereal tone that station. Many called for a return to autonomy, others for the end of the impositions. The runes of unity trembled. Eric, deeply shaken, summoned a new circle of elders. He asked for public forgiveness, wept before the embers, and decreed the time of voices, 30 days in which any clan could send emissaries to suggest changes. There were advances: decentralization of stocks, reduction of obligations, return of certain local rights. But the wound still pulsated, and Eric knew ice, even if melted, never disappears. It just hides. The flame was still burning, but the embers now needed to be protected with much more care.
As Noravin's empire grew in structure, a new kind of cold began to spread. Not that of storms or eternal snow, but that of distrust, of control, of fear of contrary ideas. The Council of Embers itself, formed to represent all clans, became more and more homogeneous. The seats were now occupied by names recognized not by wisdom, but by loyalty to the Frost Keeper and the New Order. The flame that united the peoples began to burn what was divergent. It all started with the Edict of the Silent Fire, a new directive that prohibited the circulation of stories, rituals, or practices considered contrary to collective survival. These included ancient shamanic rites, songs that extolled clan autonomy, and proverbs that evoked the days of free hunting. Public bonfires were monitored by emissaries from the Harticald Guard, and skalds were questioned before telling stories. Words also freeze or inflame, justified a counselor named Hjalti, the pragmatist. And we are surrounded by treacherous wind. Freydis immediately objected. He argued that the gods speak in multiple voices, and that to silence a part of them would be to mutilate the spirit of the people. Astrid also protested, remembering that wisdom is not born from repetition, but from the diversity of knowledge. But the majority followed Hjalti, and a dicto was approved. In the following months,
books were collected. Ancient runes drawn on stones of ancient wisdom have been removed for analysis. The smaller temples, built on hills and valleys, were decommissioned in favor of the central temple of the flame in Vetterheim, where rituals were standardized. With this, the Word Guards emerged, a division of the Hartecald Guard trained not to protect against the cold, but to watch over thoughts. They visited teachers, priests, and even families, listening to songs, analyzing speeches, and rebuking fragments of ideological ice. Eric did not directly participate in these decisions. Some said that he isolated himself in meditation. Others, that they did not want to see what was being done in their name. When he finally spoke to the people, he limited himself to saying, "The flame needs containment, or it devours everything around." The phrase divided the Skalds. Some chanted it as a reminder of wisdom. Others accused it of justifying tyranny. On the banks of Norrvind, secret manuscripts began to circulate. Poems that spoke of the forgotten dawn, of freedom before the ice, of when each clan sang its own song. One of these voices was Ursa the Grey, a storyteller from the Dawn Wolves clan. She traveled from village to village telling fables with changed names, but with clear messages. The centralization that saved also suffocated. Ursa was captured in a village in Torngald and brought to Vetterheim. The people demanded justice. But what would justice be? Condemn a voice for singing pain? Or release a spark that could set everything on fire? Eric attended the trial. He looked Ursa in the eyes, and she whispered, "The cold is back, Guardian. Only now it comes from within." The silence in the hall was absolute. Eric turned around and left the trial. Days later, Ursa disappeared. Some say she ran away. Others that it was secretly released. Hjalti said she was exiled to where her voice no longer hurt the wind. The truth was lost in the echo of the mountains. But that winter, even with plentiful provisions and safe routes, few slept peacefully. The flame burned, but now on ashes of burnt ideas. And the gods, they were silent.
Time passed, and with it came the most profound transformations. The name of Eirik, the keeper of the ice, came to be chanted with reverence and fear. He was remembered as the one who defied the cold and united men, but also as the one under whose gaze the flame began to consume the voices of the wind. Even after his retirement from direct leadership, Eirik became a legendary figure. He lived his last years in the hills near the central temple, in a simple hut built with sacred stones from all the tribes. There, it received few visitors, usually young dreamers or old men in search of wisdom. His word had become rare, and every sentence was recorded by the Skalds as if it were a living rune. Freydis, Bjorn, and Astrid remained at the center of public life. Astrid took over the Hall of Roots and dedicated herself to preserving the culture of the ancient clans, hiding scrolls and songs that were once forbidden. Bjorn trained a new generation of guardians, more philosophical than warriors, and Freydis founded the Circles of Voices, spaces where villages met to discuss the direction of Norravind away from the influence of the capital. But Eirik's legacy was not just made up of heroic deeds or laws. It was built on contradiction. The union he founded survived, but had to be remodeled. After his death, silent, on a night without dawn, the clans convened an assembly of flames and decided to dissolve the Council of Embers in its old form. In their place, the Fire Forums emerged, local assemblies connected by messengers where no voice could be louder than the other for more than one moon cycle. The Hjartaknhald Guard was split into 3 orders: the Keepers of the Trails, the Protectors of Knowledge, and the Mediators of Voices, each with clear roles, defined limits, and rotating votes. The Keepers of the Word were abolished, their records burned. Ursa's songs, once whispered in the shadows, began to be sung at sunset. The temples, now decentralized, returned to reflect the multiple gods of the north. Skadi, Njord, Bragi, and many others gained renewed altars. Clan festivals returned with specific dances, lost instruments were rebuilt, and bonfires were rekindled with the old plural flame. And yet, Eirik's name has not been erased. Quite the opposite. In each village, a stone was engraved with the inscription, "The one who brought the fire and learned to respect the ice." So his legacy was not empire. It was the warning. A living memory that not even absolute warmth can heal all wounds. That the balance between freedom and protection is as fragile as a sheet of ice in the sun. In the winter following his death, a great storm blanketed Norravind. But for the first time in generations, no one died of cold. Everyone was sheltered, fed, and together. The villages shared not only firewood and dried meat, they shared stories, songs, dances, and silences. And when dawn returned, many said they saw a lonely figure on the horizon, silver hair blowing in the wind, eyes fixed on the white infinity. Perhaps it was Eirik's spirit. Maybe it was just the echo of his journey. But by then, everyone knew. The ice hammer had been broken, and out of its ruin was born something greater than kings, empires, or gods. A civilization shaped by cold, warmed by memory, sustained by wisdom, and, above all, live.
Eirik's death did not end his influence. It only transformed it. The Frost Keeper had become a symbol, and symbols do not die, they multiply. The children of those who marched under his leadership now grew up in a world where the cold was no longer the absolute enemy, but rather a silent master, a reminder of humility and interdependence. The clans of Norravind no longer see each other as islands among eternal snows. They have become archipelagos, connected by bridges of knowledge, affection, and memory. The Federation continued to exist,
not as a rigid structure, but as a flexible constellation. The flame assemblies flourished, generating new local solutions that echoed in the far reaches of the territory. A new cycle began, the time of the Ember Builders. Young men trained in both clan traditions and Vetrimer apprenticeships traveled between villages to document stories, teach winter farming methods, develop thermal fabric techniques, carve natural greenhouses, and redraw the maps of migration trails. The old hunting paths were now used by teachers, healers, musicians, and poets. Bjorn, in his later years, founded the School of the Hammer and the Psalm, where he trained future guardians to protect wisely and listen courageously. Astrid, already elderly, dictated the last volumes of the Book of the Tissues of the Soul, a compendium of stories, myths, and teachings that brought together the knowledge of all the peoples of the north. Freydis, revered as the voice of the gods, made her last appearance at a festival of dawn, saying, "We have not conquered the world. We earned the right to sing it together." But the outside world was beginning to change. Merchants from the south, lured by rumors of a civilization that had conquered winter, began to arrive along the sea routes. They brought spices, worked metal, concepts of navigation, and ideas about other types of empire. The curiosity was mutual. For the first time, Noravin's children saw themselves not just as survivors, but as bearers of something the rest of the world didn't yet know. A civilization born of ice, shaped by adversity and guided by human warmth. And so, the empire that Eric never wanted to found was finally born, not as a throne, but as an inheritance of practices, values, and mythologies. There was no capital, no king, no flag. There was only one collective identity, the people who overcame the cold without burning their spirits. Future generations have not forgotten. During the harshest winters, they still told the stories of Eric, Astrid, Freydis, Bjorn, and Ursa. Each clan added its version, its details, its metaphors. And so, like the heat on a well-kept fire, the legacy spread without ever going out. Noravind was no longer just a place. It was a way of existing, a compass between fire and ice, a living memory. And the empire that emerged, it was made of stories,